Welcome to the set of videos on privacy and confidentiality, which I think are extremely important to understand, particularly when we're dealing with data on human subjects. So what I'm going to do is to talk about the context, so framework, and then some practical implications. So first of all, what do we mean by privacy and confidentiality? Well, typically what we're dealing with here is dealing with confidentiality. Privacy is the right to be left alone. It is controlling your own data, controlling who has access to it. Typically, as government analysts and researchers, we're dealing with data that have already been made available, whether they're through the administration of government programs or through the digital exhaust of what we do in our everyday lives, social media, cell phones, and so on. And so the real topic of interest is confidentiality. How do we ethically make sure that no harm or risk is associated with our access and use of the data? That, in other words, we're trying to make the maximum value for policy without harming an individual. So you'll notice I used two words interchangeably just then, risk and harm. And in fact, actually, they're a little bit different. Typically, when we talk about privacy risk, we're talking about the re-identification of an individual. In other words, finding out some attribute of the individual as a result of access to data about them that one would not have known without that access. So that is clearly distinct from harm. So risk means, can you find out something about me? For example, or in that case, all variables or all measures are equally of concern, whether it is, whether I'm a female or my age, or, whether or not I'm an axe murderer or carry a disease that could affect my likelihood of getting insurance. Harm is finding out something about me as an individual that could affect me. My income, I might be more sensitive about my income, about my medical history, about my judicial history, and so on. It can also occur at group level. In other words, I might be of a class of individuals that, knowing information about a group level of earnings or a group set of behaviors, that might have a negative impact. You could think about the internment of Japanese in the Second World War, where Census Bureau data was used to find out where individual Japanese were living, and then round them up and put them in internment camps. Another issue with harm is, do we think about harm immediately or a discounted level? In other words, if you find out something about me and then it could affect my children, do I value it immediately now, or do I evaluate it as it might affect them in 20 years? There is also a distinction, as I just made, about finding out information about me in general and particular items, for example, child abuse or so on. So that's the problem in a nutshell, is as a result of having access to data about me, what is the impact on me and on my social or economic well-being? Why does it matter to a researcher or to a government agency? Well, first of all, typically, certainly in a survey and quite often with administrative data, we make a promise. We say we are going to protect your data. So there is a promise that we have made, and so ethically we have to stand up and hold to that promise. Even if we haven't made that promise, there is an ethical requirement that's quite often codified in terms of, if you're a researcher, in terms of review by an institutional review board, and just in terms of being a good scientist, you want to do good. There's quite often a legal requirement. If you're working with data, for example, in the ADRF, you signed a form in which both you and your employer agreed to abide by the statutory or legal requirements that are codified in your access to and use of the data. If it's federal data, there's typically federal statute. State data, there's statutory requirements. And those can be quite binding. They can be quite serious. For Title 26 of the US Code, for example, it's 10 years in jail and or $750,000 fine for each individual breach. So that legal requirement's not just something to ignore. From a practical point of view, for an agency, what they're very worried about is the trust of the public in their access, in their use of the data. So they have promised, and they are legally bound to take care of the data that they are statutorily obligated to take care of. And if they breach that, then there will be a great deal of consequences with the legislature, with their funding. For a university researcher, if there is a breach by the researcher and the institutional review board has signed off on it, they can lose access to all federal funding, not just for that researcher, but for the university as a whole. So there are quite practical implications and a need to worry about it. But obviously, the rules are starting to change. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and as people are more and more worried about public health and worried about protecting their health as a result of the pandemic, there's much more use of cell phones and tracking devices. And so the privacy rules that existed in 2019 the public consent seems to have changed over the past year. We've also got new types of cities. So the policy relevance of having access to these data can be huge. If we're worried about the quality of life, the pollution levels, the noise levels, information about crowding, information about emergency exits, you can find out that information using the smart city information, the sensors that are around that track movements, can figure out when streets need cleaning, when they need to be plowed in a snowstorm, what's been done and what's not been. And so there is a massive amount of data that is available in order to do much better policy if we can figure out how to deal with the privacy and confidentiality issues. And clearly the public good can be tremendous if we're able to target medicine much more carefully to particular individuals rather than just blast out drugs to or interventions to a vast group of people. One can be much more precise in the way in which one do about in how to design policies. So there's new data, new risks, new value, and we really don't have a particularly good legal framework to deal with it. Historically, the data were controlled by statistical agencies. I talked about Title 26, the IRS data. Title 13 is census data. CIPSI, the Confidential Information Protection Statistical Efficiency Act. All of those provide a legislative framework within which statistical agencies can collect and use data. Most of you are also familiar with the health data rules with HIPAA, as well as the education data rules with FERPA. But what happens in this new world is very different. The data that I cited before, internet data, cell phone data, social media data, that does not have a legal framework within which we operate. And so now the question is what's the framework within which we operate? What are the rules? How can we access and make use of data in a way where we're not aware of what the rules are? So it turns out that there has been a great deal of thinking about how to do things better, how to deal with the new types of data. There's a very good report by the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking. You'll notice it talks about data is the focus, but the one thing that they worry about is privacy. They've got that right there, right next to data, transparency, along with rigor, capacity, and humility. So there are some very good ideas that have been identified in that report, which came out in 2017. And there is now also administrative mandates to federal agencies about the federal data strategy, how to consistently access and use data. So that federal data strategy is also something to go and take a look at. So there are a bunch of questions. There aren't a whole lot of answers. I still like the book that Victoria Stodden, Stepan Bender, and Helen Nissenbaum and I edited. We brought together chapters and discussions from some of the top people in the country and the world that talks about what the issues are and recognizing that the conversation still is ongoing. Please answer the questions on the website. Thank you.